Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Real Effective Answers for Life with your host, Tammy and Tara, where we deal with real people, real life, and real answers for the taboo life issues that many refuse to address. And we are so very excited about the discussions planned and pray that with each one, it will bring insight, hope, healing, and freedom as we all remember to keep it real so God can deal and we can heal. Welcome to Real Effective Answers for Life with your host, Tammy and
Tara.
And once again, we're here where we believe in keeping it real so that God can deal and we can all heal because we are real people dealing with real life and we need real answers. And so once again, we're coming to you and excited about the topic that we'll be discussing, and hope that, as always, that it will be a time of healing, a time of insight, and just a time of total, complete liberty and freedom. And Tara, you want to open up with what our topic is going to be?
Absolutely. So October is National Domestic Abuse Awareness Month. They actually call it Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but we're going to be touching on more than just physical violence in today's episode. And so that's why I addressed it as domestic abuse. We will be actually touching on this topic throughout the month with our different podcasts and also at different posts that you may see on our social media. And we want to make sure that we are letting you know that this topic may be triggering. So if you need to take just a moment to hit pause and come back after you've taken a moment away, feel free to do so, because it's really important that you take care of you as we are addressing these hard topics. Today, we're going to take some time to share some of our personal stories. Both Tammy and I have experienced domestic abuse and are survivors of such. And so we're going to share our personal stories today, and then we will get into more general information in future podcasts. Tammy, did you want to start?
Sure. I have shared previously, but probably will be sharing more in depth today with regards to my story, actually my story of abuse. Did not start with domestic abuse. It actually began with my childhood. And actually you're really talking about 6 generations of that abusive cycle. Sometimes the church calls it a generational curse. Psychology, counseling, they call it a family cycle. But it began, I would say, several generations back, where you had, the grandmother raising the grandchildren. And in many of the scenarios, my grandmother was abused by her grandmother who raised her. She, in turn, when she got custody of us, was very abusive with us. On top of being abusive with us, she married into abusive marriages, which didn't help in terms of how she handled us as well, because it kind of added to that aggressive, abusive environment. And then, of course, I, in turn, I had a heart and I had purposed as a little girl, when I grew up, I'm never going to deal with this, and I wouldn't put up with X, Y, and Z. And, I'm going to do better than how I was raised. However, I had zeal without knowledge. But God in his grace, allowed me to walk through that process of healing, in the areas that I wasn't aware, as I walked through the different issues of abuse. God then began to heal me through that and to equip me to now come back and begin to be a help for others, because we're not just doing a podcast on abuse without ever having gone through it, or knowing the dynamics, knowing the psychological warfare, knowing the mental processing that you go through, the hurt, the healing that it takes, walking through these issues. So mine was something that certainly started generationally. My mother, my grandmother raised us. My grandmother's grandmother raised her. All abusive situations. circumstances where, the women getting pregnant early, and because they were pregnant, they all married, and each time married into an abusive relationship. My father was extremely abusive with my mother. My grandmother, her marriage to her first husband was an abusive marriage. And then she, in turn, when she raised us, was very abusive with us. Which goes to the childhood side of it. I dealt with it because of my grandmother. That's all that she knew. So, in turn, when she called herself disciplining us, that's how we were disciplined. With the switches and I can remember the heat of the summer, and I'm wearing, long sleeve sweatshirt and long pants instead of shorts and a t-shirt like most kids would, covering the scars and covering the bruises, where I would have whelps and, they're bleeding, and literally like almost like whelps and whip marks is what it looked like uh, from where, that was her way of disciplining us. And, the psychological, you acting just like your mother, even being called a female pregnant dog, just like my mother, being cussed at, being yelled at. There was, obviously the physical side, and even just neglect too, as well. I mean, it's on one hand, it was weird because we wanted for nothing in terms of materialistic wise, in terms of clothes, food, that kind of thing. She made sure that we were provided for as far as those things were concerned, but she neglected our need, like as children, I guess you would say, in terms of like socialization and being able to just have a normal childhood, because oftentimes she was out partying or she was doing her thing, and we were, kind of left in the house most of the time, couldn't go outside, or if we did go outside, my great grandmother actually, who lived downstairs and we lived upstairs, she would watch us sometimes. But I mean, as far as that interaction with her as a mother to daughters and spending time and that type of thing, a lot of times we were by ourselves. We were pretty much kind of raising ourselves. She'd make sure we ate, and then she was gone.
Right.
Um, but there was a lot of, belittlement, a lot of, the yelling, the putting down. I can even remember finally just getting fed up and fighting with her physically on my graduation day. It was my senior prom, not senior prom, sorry guys, but it was my senior year of graduation. And literally just before graduating, my sister did something like she often would, and then blamed it on me, and then so my grandmother, because she couldn't figure out who did it, we both had to deal with the consequences. And I just remember she pushed me down, and I got angry, and it was like I just snapped, and so I literally remember fighting with her just before graduating. And then, of course, I also moved out shortly after that. I also dealt with sexual abuse as a child, all under the guise of sex education. But it was not. It was more or less sexual abuse. And I also had older cousins, that um, had to deal with sexual abuse, and I mean, I can remember very vividly, like being downstairs in the basement, and there was like a bedroom set up in the basement, and, we would go down there thinking we're watching movies or whatever. And, you know, just remembering dealing with those instances where, being sexually assaulted pretty much. And stuff that we didn't even talk about either. We never even told anybody growing up until later on, you know.
That's so common.
Oh, absolutely. Because you're
Yeah.
scared, or you think you did something wrong, or,
Right.
nobody's going to believe me anyway. And then you carry the shame of that too, and you feel like you're dirty, or, something's wrong with you.
Right.
And even just, I can remember even with my grandmother, because of the people that she hung around, they were smoking and they were drinking and whatever. And I can even remember like just being in the back seat of the car, and, a man that was in the car, they were taking him home, and, him trying to, touch me inappropriately, and me literally like squeezing my legs together as close as I could to keep him from being able to touch me inappropriately. So definitely, was exposed to a lot of, child abuse, sexual, being touched inappropriately. Um, And then, of course, because of that, I married into that, because again, zeal without knowledge, I had a desire to do better. I believed God to do better with my
Mhm.
own children and even with my own life. But because I didn't have the education, because I didn't have the understanding that, back then you didn't talk about domestic violence, you didn't talk
Right.
about child abuse, you didn't talk about sexual abuse. And so, it was kind of like, okay, I want to do better, but didn't know how to do better, had
Right.
no clue where to even start with doing better.
Which is why conversations like this are so important.
Absolutely.
Because oftentimes when we go through these things, we don't know how to reverse the cycle and
Mhm.
break the cycle. And so having these conversations and sharing with one another is so important because it removes some of that shame
It sure does.
and allows us to have discussions so that the things that we've walked through and learned we can share with other people, or what they've learned they can share with other people. So then you are able to do things differently and
Mhm.
do things better than what you
Absolutely.
experienced. And so that's our whole goal in being able to have these difficult discussions, is
And
to
it
lift that.
and it also brings the freedom of being able to talk about it,
It does.
because that's where the bondage has its hold, is
Hmm.
because it's done in secret,
Yep.
because it's not talked about, because
Right.
it's not discussed. And so you continue to carry that, you
Hmm.
continue to hold that, and it also allows the abuser or abusers to continue to function,
Right.
because they know they can count on you not to say anything or
Absolutely.
not to talk about it. So prayerfully, in our being willing to talk and being willing to share, it will free you up to share, and to talk with someone that you can count on or
Hmm.
that you trust to talk to be able to get the healing and to begin the healing process that's needed.
Right.
And then of course, from both spousal as well as, my childhood, because I married into that. I dealt with a lot of physiological abuse, psychological abuse, the belittlement, you're nothing, you ain't gonna never mount to anything, you're a wannabe, made to feel like I was less than a woman. Because with my grandmother being gone, a lot of the times we weren't taught how to cook. We weren't taught how to, now we can clean the house all day, every day, because we were her maids, if
Yeah.
you will, we were like her little mini maids. And and so, constantly picking up, cleaning up, that kind of thing.
Right.
But never taught to cook, or she didn't have time because she was too busy trying to prepare to go out or do her thing.
Hmm.
So, we were in the way in the kitchen. So, marrying and then made to feel like, oh, I was less than a woman because I didn't know how to cook the way they wanted me to cook. And I dealt with that from even, like the physical, obviously the fighting, the shoving, the pushing. Although I must admit, not proud, but I did physically fight back. Because by that time, like I said, I had already fought with my grandmother, my graduation. And so when I married, I was like, I'll be daggone. I dealt with this, in my childhood. I'm not about to deal with this,
Yeah.
being grown and married. But I dealt with it in the sense that I stayed in it longer than I should have, all in the name of the Lord. And unfortunately, that affected my girls and it impacted my girls
Yeah.
to a degree. I thank God for his grace and mercy, and
Mhm.
he is bringing them out of it as he's brought me out of it. But still walking through that, walking through the fighting, midnight hours, and walking through the slamming and us fighting back and forth. And like I said, I physically fought back. um but still, it doesn't take away from, the hurt of your, you're crying and you're upset, and or you're sharing your heart and you're letting this person know, listen, your behavior is hurting me, and they're laughing in your face,
Mhm.
and you're just soft, or whatever, you just being emotional, and basically, almost them laughing in your face and taunting you for crying, or because or it was my fault. Everything that went wrong was
Right.
my fault. And if you would have just did what I was, if I just did what I was supposed to do, we wouldn't have those
Right.
problems. And even in the church, because I can remember talking to a pastor one time for counseling, and I remember him, oh, well, he's just a man and he's just trying to, set his house in order. He doesn't mean any harm. And so I remember asking him, okay, can I ask you a question? And I said, why is it okay then, for the man, when he's upset, it's okay for him to yell and whatever, but he doesn't mean any harm. He's just trying to, keep order in the house and he wants things to be right. But then when the woman desires those same things, she's nagging.
Yeah.
She's being a
That's a good
nagging
point.
wife, and she's being a contentious woman. And literally, I never forgot, because initially when he was talking to me, he was kind of like sitting across the desk like this when I said, and then he literally like sat up straight in his chair, and he just looked at me for about a second or so, and it felt like the longest seconds ever. And he says, "You know what? That's a good question." It's the same thing he
Yeah.
said. I think it at that point may have even been a light bulb for him of the fallacy and the wrong
Mhm.
teachings that have come across the pulpit in
Right.
terms of domestic violence and the roles of the wife versus the husband, and what's acceptable for the husband to do in mistreatment of the woman, but the roles reversed, or that
Right.
hypocrisy when it's the female.
Yeah.
Um, so I dealt with definitely a lot of, it was more psychological, because when they realized, okay, was going to fight back, that did away with it in the first marriage. I
Mhm.
think, we probably only physically got into it maybe 3 times. And the third time it ended with me actually exploding again. So that did away with it. But the psychological, just, the people coming over, and we had small groups in our home at that time, and, at the church, and, constantly like putting me down, and, making derogatory comments if anyone said something positive about me
Yeah.
during, the group sessions. And you know, things like even just the taking the car, preventing me from going places. If, when I was going through Bible school, one of the Bible schools, and because he was angry, he takes off with the car. I wasn't driving at the time, thinking that that was going to prevent me from going to class, knowing that that was the last day that we
Mhm.
had to be there, or we wouldn't be able to graduate
Mhm.
from the class. So I took an Uber, which he didn't anticipate. But still, just that whole thing of control of
Right.
taking the car, that whole thing of when a pastor sold a car into my life, he was supposed to go pick the car up and bring it back home. And he decides to sell it in between going to pick it up and bringing it back home, so that I had no method or means of transportation.
Yeah.
I can think of when I interviewed for a job, and I was working as a pharmacy technician, and I'm upstairs in the manager's office interviewing. You knew when you dropped me off there that I was interviewing, but you decide you're tired of waiting. Rather than taking the kids home, we were what, 5 minutes away, if that, and then coming back or having me call when I was done, you decide to yell from the bottom of the steps. I guess he
Mm.
asked them, because the manager's office was like upstairs,
Right.
in the Kroger's. And, rather than, like I said, texting, whatever, to have me call you when I'm done, ask, I guess, the employees where the manager's office is. You
Mhm.
knocking on, banging on the bottom of the manager's door, when you going to be done?
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I've dealt with a lot of it was a lot,
Yeah.
and then and then angry, I dealt with him because I had my oldest daughter outside of marriage, literally, she's a baby. And because you're angry with me, you push me and her outside in the freezing cold, and she's
Mm.
no clothes on whatsoever
Mm.
in the winter. But thank God for neighbors who saw what was going on, and they
Right.
called the police. So before I even got up the street
Yeah.
to where the park was, the police was cutting me off and asking me, did I live at such and such? And um, so definitely I've dealt with, I would say, abuse almost from every aspect of
Mhm.
abuse, if you will.
Yeah.
Even the sexual abuse in the marriage. And, people, the marriage bed is undefiled, defraud ye not one another, your body, doesn't belong to you, it belongs to your husband, that kind of thing, the different scriptures. And all of it has its right place and balance. But not when it's being used as a method
Right.
of
A weapon.
punishment or as a weapon.
Mhm.
Yes, when it's, that you've just offended me. You know that you've just insulted me, called me everything but a child of God, and cussed me out, and talked bad about me, all but talked about me like as if you're talking about some woman off the street. I'll just put it that way. Um, and
Not your
versus your
wife.
wife,
Yeah.
that, yes.
Yeah.
And then now you wanted me to be intimate,
Yeah.
knowing that I didn't want to be with you that way,
Right.
knowing that and then trying to use that. Uh, well, the Bible says, defraud ye not one another, although I did get to the point again, where it was like, I don't care. don't touch me,
Yeah.
but it was still just the whole mentality behind it and that
Mhm.
mindset behind it,
Right.
to even demand it, or to even expect me to go along with that.
Yeah.
Definitely I've dealt with it from every aspect. I can tell you, time will not allow me to go into every single detail by detail. But I will say, after marrying into it the first time, I thought I had healed and I was good and okay, I got this time, and then I ended up marrying into it again. A lot of the same scenario, although the second time it was more physical than psychological. And the sad part is that we actually pastored a church together. So, there were mornings of literally physically fighting on our way out to go worship. And, me being called, I abandoned ship. I, deflector, whatever, because I refused to stay in that toxic environment because my heart was, I don't want to be a hypocrite and I don't want to be talking about the love of God and, praying for people and whatever else. And I've got total chaos going on in my house. But, I was viewed as I was wrong because I left. But it's okay. I thank God that I did. Because I knew that either one or both of us would end up dead or in jail. I also had my daughters, again, that unfortunately were impacted by that even more so because they were older. So, making that choice is not, sometimes, no, it does not always have to end in divorce, but there are times when it does. And especially if that person is not willing to get the help or the counseling needed to stop the abuse, it's necessary. And so now I don't regret it. Yes, I struggled as a single mom of 5 children, because of choosing to divorce. But when I see where God is bringing my girls now,
Mhm.
when I see His hand in their life now, even just my own life, when I see where God has brought me and where He is yet to take me, I thank Him that for me, I made the choice to get out of it because it was necessary. And so if you're dealing with abuse, know that that's not God's portion for you. If that person's willing to get counseling, I still suggest you may need to separate
Mhm.
and get
Absolutely.
the counseling, so that everybody's in a safe space. And even with the counseling, because sometimes that can trigger negative emotion.
Mhm.
So being in that safe, separate place gives you that opportunity to process what's said without exploding on each other and coming back again. But it doesn't always have to end in divorce. You can separate and then perhaps get the counseling and at the right time come back together. But if that spouse is unwilling, sometimes you have to make that hard decision to end it in divorce. But know that there's still hope. Know that God still loves you
Mhm.
and that that is not the heart of God for you. He does not desire. In fact, God, even in Malachi, He told the children of Israel, I have a problem with you because you're dealing treacherously, meaning wrongfully. You're mistreating the wife of your youth. So to say that that's, okay, or God can, God does not condone that. God's not, He doesn't allow that. He's not accepting of that just because, quote unquote, you're in the church. That's not His heart toward His women or for
Right.
the men either, because women can be just as abusive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing all of that. I know it's hard a lot of times to be able to share those types of details, but like we said earlier, we're sharing our stories in an effort to provide hope and encouragement to those who may be going through hard times, or those who know somebody who's going through a hard time and are trying to be there for them. And it's interesting in listening to your story how there's so many similarities,
mhm,
and then yet so many differences.
mhm,
So it's awesome just to know that one of the similarities is that God saw us through.
yes,
He kept us and saw us through each one of those scenarios. And most people aren't going to look at us and think that we've gone through the things that we have.
exactly.
Um, I'm a survivor, but I'm so thankful that I went through different traumas and I went through abuse and hardships and challenges. just as you were talking about.
Mhm.
But I've also experienced hope and healing and growth and God's goodness and his faithfulness. And I'm so thankful that both of us are able to sit here today and even be able to discuss it. There's so many times when people don't make it.
Yes.
And so I'm thankful that we're able to share the story to be able to provide encouragement and hopefully hope for those who may not be feeling any hope right now.
Absolutely.
Um,
Been there too.
yeah,
And certainly been there who was like, God, if you don't do this, it's not getting done,
exactly.
you know?
And, like Tammy, I experienced childhood abuse. And, my childhood abuse began at the age of 5 and didn't end until I was 17 when I left the home. Um, and just as Tammy was talking about, oftentimes we go from abuse to abuse. And
Mhm.
the abuse that I experienced as a child included physical abuse at times. It included mostly sexual abuse and psychological abuse. There were the mental and emotional things that were
Mhm.
done.
Mhm.
Just like you were talking about, he stated I was never going to grow up to be anything. And I was always in the wrong. It didn't matter what I was doing. I was always being yelled at and always felt like I couldn't do anything right.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I was also exploited through child sexual abuse material. And so I experienced all these different types of abuses, like you talked about, just a variety of different types coming from different angles. But one thing that stands out to me is the fact that God, even in the midst of all of that, made himself
Yes.
very real to me as a child.
Yes. Yes. Oh, yes.
And
Oh,
so I'm
yes.
thankful for that because I know that that's what's kept me
Oh,
through.
yes.
But I did go from abuse to abuse, just as you were talking about. So I left my home at 17 and walked right into the hands of another abuser. And this man became my first husband. And I was 17 when I met him. He was 5 years older than me. Um, I had been looking for love in all the wrong places,
Mhm.
as they state, just because
Yes.
of the fact that, I didn't feel that love. I didn't feel self-confident. So I was looking for other people to bring that to me.
Absolutely. Mhm.
And abusers often target people who
Absolutely.
have those experiences and are looking for that because just, even with human trafficking, they use that type of trust building
Mhm.
oftentimes and try to meet the needs that they see that you have so that then they can turn around and do what they want,
Yes.
because there's different trauma bonds and things like that that are
It's like
built.
they identify the need so that they can exploit the need and exploit
Absolutely.
you according to that need. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And so with him, I did end up pregnant early in the relationship, and he wasn't nice from the beginning. But when
Mhm.
you've grown up in that type of abuse, um, that doesn't feel abnormal.
Mhm. Yes, it's real.
So, between what you've experienced as a child and then what this new abuser is telling you as far as um, you not feeling like you're doing anything right, you are always looking to, if I just do this, if
Yes.
I pray this hard, if I
Yes.
just
Yes.
make him happy in this regard, it's not that hard, going through all of this stuff, that then it'll be better. So you take on the responsibility of the abuse that you're experiencing when it's not your responsibility to take.
And if I can just interject there too, when you say that constant trying to, if I just do better, if I can just do better. But the thing is that you never can do enough
Mhm.
because once you master one thing, they find something else to nitpick
Absolutely.
about.
Yeah,
And
because
once you know what I mean, to
yeah.
keep you constantly feeling inferior and to
Mhm.
constantly feel less than capable and
Right.
worthy. And that's all a part of the tactic is to
Yeah.
keep you from gaining any type of confidence to be able to stand on your
Mhm.
own.
Because the domestic abuse, though, the goals of domestic abuse are control
Absolutely.
and to have power and control. And so, just as you were saying, you can't ever do better
Yes.
to the point where it's going to change them
Yes.
and their behavior towards you. So I did become pregnant early on, and that's when the physical abuse began. So he was upset with me because I didn't want to marry him right away. He was scaring me with how he was starting to treat me. And so he got angry and he picked me up and threw me against the wall and told me he wanted to hit me in the stomach as hard as he could. So that's when that physical abuse began. So there was the psychological and emotional abuse already occurring, um, but he hadn't physically hurt me yet. And so that is when that began. And began threatening me and telling me if I didn't marry him, that he was going to kill me and take my baby. And so at the age of 17, being pregnant, one thing I did know is that I was going to protect my baby.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that baby also gave me a hope.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, that
Yes,
became
yes.
something that I really focused on with um, trying to protect myself and trying to protect what became my oldest son. But the physical abuse just got worse and worse and worse. So anytime you're staying in thinking, or anytime you leave and go back,
Oh, yeah.
it gets worse and worse.
Oh, yeah.
I
Oh,
also
yeah.
experienced sexual abuse. So one of the worst times that I remember experiencing was 3 weeks after I had my oldest son, and just, I had the stitches and everything that goes
Mhm.
along with the healing process that you need.
Mm.
And he was not okay with the fact of not being able to have sexual relations. And
Mhm.
so he put a gun in my mouth and raped me for that night. Um, and so that
Mhm.
was this probably one of the scariest times, just because my 3-week-old baby is
Mhm.
asleep and I'm worried about dying. And then what happens to my baby? And so that is one of the scariest times that I remember, with the
Mhm.
sexual abuse. But I also experienced rape while being strangled and rape while being smothered. Um, and
Mhm.
he really enjoyed like beating you. You didn't have to be doing anything or stating anything. You could just be sitting there taking care of whatever you needed to take care of. And he said that he got an adrenaline rush when he would beat me. So that was something that he enjoyed doing.
Mhm.
So the physical abuse was a lot. Whether he was beating me or dragging me by my hair or throwing things at me. Um, but the sexual abuse was just as scary.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I also experienced financial abuse, which I don't think gets talked about nearly enough.
Yes, I meant to. Yes. Yes.
And I think that why it's so important that we discuss it is because they often use financial abuse to keep you stuck.
Absolutely.
So if they can keep you
Absolutely.
stuck because there's no way to escape as far as what you feel,
Absolutely.
then you're stuck in this pattern and you feel hopeless. But he controlled all of the finances, and I couldn't even go to the grocery store
Mhm.
without him going with me, because there was one time that I bought a bag of cookies that wasn't on the list, and therefore I lost that privilege. And so things like that were even controlled. And he opened up credit cards in my name and would charge really expensive things like motorcycles. I didn't even find out about some of that stuff until I was going through my divorce. So
Mhm.
so that was the type of financial abuse that they try to control and ruin your
Credit or your.
yeah,
Mhm.
in an effort to keep you stuck.
Um,
um
oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Now, I was going to say another one too that I thought about was also uh, where you have no clue what their finances look like,
Right.
none whatsoever. And meanwhile, they've got this stash or they've got their savings or they
Hmm.
have whatever. But meanwhile, as you were already stating, they're fully aware of your every finance,
Right.
or almost demanding to see when you get paid and what you got
Mhm.
paid, and dictating how you spend your
Mhm.
paycheck. Meanwhile, you have no clue whatsoever what their
Yeah.
paycheck looks like or where the money met or
Right.
how they're spending their money.
He even took my birthday money. I wasn't even allowed to have that. um so they definitely, like we talked about, power and control. That's what all of
Mhm,
this is about.
mhm.
I also experienced mental and emotional abuse, as
Oh,
you
yeah.
can imagine. As you're going through all these other things,
Oh,
it's not
yeah.
like they're going to be nice with their words
Exactly.
and
Oh,
and
I
all of
love
that,
you. You're so
right?
adorable. The best thing that ever happened to
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
And so a lot of what he was saying to me reinforced what I was hearing as I was growing up and dealing with that
Yes.
abuse. So that
Same
reinforcement just,
spirit.
yeah,
Same.
just makes you start to believe it even more, like what
Mhm.
they're saying, like, you know, and causes you to have even lower self-esteem and, being afraid because they try to make you feel like you're not going to be able to make it without them, that
Oh
nobody
yeah.
else would ever want to
Oh
deal
yeah.
with you.
Oh yeah.
And
You're damaged goods.
yeah,
Ain't nobody gonna want to deal with you. You're useless. What are you, you better be glad I'm here.
right.
You ought to be thankful I want that somebody wants you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I also was afraid because he talked about, even with random people walking down the street, how he would have desire to kill them, to the point where his hands would start sweating. And so as he's threatening to kill me and doing things that I know, whether it's strangulation, or whether it was the smothering, or whatever he was doing to me, I, I already knew that he wanted to kill. So, that made that even scarier.
Oh, absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and so I became really hopeless and didn't feel like there was any way out, because of not having any resources, and because of, all the threats made. And when I would leave, he would threaten to hurt the people that would try
Mhm.
to help. And so then
Mhm.
you don't want anybody else to have to deal
Exactly.
with things
Exactly.
because of helping you. So you just begun to feel more and more hopeless. But then he hurt my boys.
Mhm.
And that's where everything changed for me, because, it should have changed.
That was the same with me.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
should have changed
Same
when
with
I
me.
was experiencing the abuse. However, when he hurt my boys, it then started to click in me that it didn't matter if I died trying to leave and trying to protect them. We were getting out of there.
Mhm.
And so we did leave, but, as with any other type of abusive situation, it's not like they say, "Well, have a good life," and just let you walk away. That's
Mhm.
not where things stop. The judicial system can be very difficult,
Absolutely.
um, especially
Absolutely.
for the victims. And, we still dealt with stalking and threats and him popping up different places, whether it was our home or my place of employment or our church. And so, we still continue to deal with the fear and the threats and all of the anxiety that goes with that.
Mhm.
Um, but then he ended up assaulting a girl right after me that he was talking to, even though he was still creating hardship in our lives. He was
Still doing.
also
Mhm.
doing stuff on the side.
Mhm.
And so he assaulted somebody after me, but then went even further in his relationship after that. He did marry another woman, and he brutally murdered her. So he beat her to death, and she had recently had a baby, and the baby
Mm.
was there. And so he killed her in his mother's home, where they were staying. And, the prosecutor's
Mm.
office said that it was the most gruesome case that they had ever dealt with. And so I grieved for a woman that I never
Mm.
knew,
Mhm.
because she lived my worst nightmare.
Mhm.
And there was a lot that went on with that case. I received a death threat because they wanted to use me as a similar transaction witness. And, there was a lot that went on. He did get convicted, which was amazing, but I still lived in fear for
Sure.
so many
Sh-
years.
Sure.
Just knowing about the possibility, again, our judicial system is one of the many systems that need to be fixed.
Absolutely.
And so living in that fear of when he's going to be released, what am I going to do?
Mhm.
And he has been released. But God has been so faithful to me, because even in the release, I have not lived in terror like I expected to
That's
live
that
in.
part right there. When you have that confidence that God's got you.
Yeah.
That's
And
yes.
he has granted me peace, and he's, granted me just the ability to live without that terror.
Mhm.
Of
Mhm.
course, we take precautions, and we're aware of
Very
different
much
threats
aware.
that have been made,
Absolutely.
and things like that. So it's not that we just dismiss it and have our heads up in the clouds. But just being able to rely on God's direction,
You
God's
use wisdom, but you're
protection.
not fearful.
Yes.
Mhm.
God's direction, God's protection, and then the resources that we have to be able to use. So I'm so thankful that I'm able to be here and share that story, just so that those who are walking through these hard times and walking through abuse, you can hear that you don't deserve this.
No.
There is
No.
hope, and there are so many people like us who care about you and what you're going through. Um, you don't have to stay in a situation where you are being mistreated in any way.
No.
It does not have to be physical abuse for
Yes.
it to be abuse. We
Yes.
listed a variety of different types of
Absolutely.
abuses that we endured, and it doesn't have to be physical abuse that causes you to leave. You don't deserve to be treated any less than being the child of God that you are, and his special creation, and you have a purpose, and God has a plan for your life. And if you have children, the same for your children.
Especially
Yes.
because when you do not, when you do stay, you're reproducing that cycle in your
Mhm.
children because they are very much aware of everything that's going on. And I
Yes.
don't care how small you might think they are, and you may not think that they're aware,
Mhm.
but they see and they're very much aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
And you reproduce that cycle in them that it's okay
Yeah.
to accept this kind of behavior. And you hear it over and over and over again. I married into this, or I ended up this way because this is how I grew up.
Yeah.
I saw my mom dealing with it from my dad, and so I thought this was normal or this was okay.
Mhm.
And that's where that generational curse or that family cycle comes in,
Yeah.
because people stay when they need to get out.
Mhm. And your experiences may be different. You may not experience all the same exact things that we have. But we've all experienced hardships and hurts. And one thing that has helped me to know that no matter what I'm facing or what I'm going through is that God never leaves us alone.
No, he doesn't. He says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you.
He's always with us. So when you
Yes,
feel like you don't have anybody else in your corner and that you're alone in what you're experiencing, just know that you are not alone.
absolutely.
And again, there are many of us who also want to walk alongside you in your healing and your growth, and in the time of being able to dream about what is in front of you for your life, and just being able to live out the purpose that you were created to live out.
Yes,
But we also want to address a very short instance of different resources and tools that are available to you, to provide safety. And we
absolutely.
will be going into depth more in our future podcasts about this topic. But today, we just want to make sure that you know that there are some immediate resources,
Yes,
if you are in a situation and need them. And one of the best resources is being able to talk to somebody that you trust.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Just like you said, being able to talk about that and being believed brings freedom.
It does. It
Even if it's
does.
not complete freedom
It
right
does.
away, it
It
starts
does.
bringing that freedom that you need to be able to take the next step and the next
Yes.
step and the
Yes.
next step. But obviously, calling 911 if you're in immediate
That's what I
danger,
was just, mhm.
is really really
Mm.
important, so that you can get the help that you need and the protection that you need, if you're able to call that number safely. And then calling the National Domestic
That's
Violence
what I was
Hotline.
I was waiting for you to finish. That's
Yeah,
what I was gonna suggest as well.
they
Mhm.
can connect you with a lot of resources. So
Like
even though,
shelter,
yeah,
temporary housing, that kind of thing. Yes.
so even when you don't feel like you have resources, so you can't leave, they can connect you with some resources to help make that,
Transition.
yeah, and
Mhm.
make that a possibility for you, so that you have somewhere to go. And that number, for the US is 1-800-799-7233. And they will also help you with safety planning, which is really, really important. And we'll be able to get into some of those details in future podcasts as well. But for those who are in immediate situations, definitely reach out to these resources, and we'll make sure that we put them in the links, in the description of the podcast as well.
And it's critical that you do reach out. Just like a person that sexually abuses a child and they threaten them that, oh, I'll kill your mom or I'll kill your dad, you know, go for help anyway. Because if that's in their mindset, eventually I would rather err on the side of caution and leave and get out with the children than to allow that threat to keep you there and you end up dead anyway. Literally, I know a story of a woman. I don't know her personally, but someone very dear to me knew her personally, was in church. She and her husband, they were separated. And and this literally just happened, I believe, like 2 weeks ago, or I think her funeral was just last week, where they buried her because she was in a domestic violence situation. She was very well known in her church, was, very well liked by many. Her husband, however, he baited her into coming because she had separated from him and was staying somewhere else. He baited her into coming back to their home, told her, he wanted to give her some more of her belongings and that she could just, come to the van in the driveway and he, have her belongings there. Meanwhile, he's waiting in the van with a fully loaded gun. And when she went to, got out of her car and went to go into the van to get her things, he just opened fire on her. And then once her body fell to the ground, he stepped outside of the van, shot her a few more times while she's down on the ground, and then fled on foot. And this is a true story, and they are still trying to locate him to this day. But because she did not get out, I mean, in this case, actually, she did get out. I have to take that back. But she still went back to the home. She still went, you've got to use caution. You've got to, maybe she should have went with someone. She should have had the police escort her there.
Or sometimes things don't need to be gotten because
Yes,
they can
it's
be
not worth
replaced.
it. Yes.
So,
Yes.
there are certain times, like in my situation, where I had to leave with nothing at first, just because it was too risky.
Absolutely.
And so, just remembering how dangerous this can actually become, don't take it lightly
That's
because,
what I guess.
yeah, things can be replaced, but you cannot be.
Yes.
So we definitely encourage you to reach out to these, whether it's 911, the National
Yes.
Domestic Violence Hotline, reaching out to people that you trust that may be able to help or at least help you plan. So,
And don't feel guilty about leaving.
right,
Don't feel shamed about leaving. Don't feel like you're being less than a Christian because you leave. Because if if you're not there, if you're not living to tell about it, what good did those things do anyway?
right,
So don't be ashamed. Don't allow fear to keep you bound or to keep you from leaving. And, don't do it, period, even if you don't have children, but especially if you have children, because again, that's repeated in them.
right.
Just, yeah, I can't say that enough.
Yeah,
Don't be guilted into staying. Don't be made to feel like, oh my gosh, you're less than a Christian. You're not praying hard enough. You know, the same way that God can move with you in the house with that person, he can still move and reconcile with you somewhere else if that's his heart for your marriage, because ultimately he knows. And don't let anyone else, even in the church, guilt you into staying into a situation like that.
right. Yeah. And so we're so thankful that you took the time to have this discussion with us because we know that it's a difficult one.
Yes, it is.
If you would like to talk with us, feel free to reach out to us as well. Of course, like I said, if you're in immediate danger, definitely utilize those other resources that we discussed to make sure that you get what you need and the protection that you need. But we're happy to talk with you as well. And you can reach us at the Real Podcast, Real Deal Heal at gmail.com. And the link will be in the description. And we just want to make sure that we encourage you today. There is hope.
Yes. And Tara, what was that scripture you were talking about? It was like Psalms 147:3.
Yes. So that is one of my favorite scriptures when talking about, how we feel when we're going through all of these really hard things when there's abuse. You just are really feel downtrodden and brokenhearted. But Psalms 147:3 says he heals the brokenhearted
Yes.
and binds up their wounds. And that helps, when you're binding up wounds, that cures the pain and the sorrow. And so God, like we talked about, never leaves us alone. He is right there with you,
Absolutely.
and his heart is with you, and his heart is to heal and
Yes.
to bring you peace and to bring you protection.
Yes. Amen. And so don't settle for anything less than that. We thank you again for joining with us. We certainly hope that our stories have helped to free you up to also one day be on the other side doing a podcast or sharing your story, sharing your testimony, writing your book, but still sharing your testimony. We pray that as God has healed and delivered us, that He will heal and deliver you, and that this podcast perhaps may be instrumental in being the first step to your coming to that place of wholeness and healing and being truly set free from the bondage of abuse, and all of the shame and guilt and all of the reprogramming and deprogramming that comes along with it. And that only happens when we always, and as we always say, keep it real
So God can deal,
and
and
we
we can
can
heal.
heal. And we just want to thank you again for joining us. We will be doing a part two, I guess, starting next week, where we'll go more into depth with the types of abuse, identifying them, what it looks like, and real life practical, not just talking about the type of abuse, but what it looks like, what it will look like in everyday life, to help you really identify, what type of relationship you're in. Because, everything's not abuse. Sometimes people swing, me, pendulum swing too far one way, too far the other. God's there in the middle with balance. And sometimes in relationships, you do have conflict.
Mhm.
You do have differences where there's exchange of words, and they're not always Jesus loves you. Like I say, you have times of intense fellowship, but there's a difference between those times and abuse. And so helping to bring scenarios to help you to identify the balance between those circumstances,
Right.
because you do have controversial situations that occur, and
Right.
it's not always abuse. So we'll be doing that, and then we'll be following up with another one that will deal more in depth with like the safety and things that you can do to get yourself to a place of safety.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to talking with you more. And as we said before, let's keep it real,
I can deal.
and we
We
can
can
heal.
heal.